Now, in order to answer this question, let me give you another kind of example where we would definitely say that the people involved were responsible for the final outcome. I'll give you the example of a relay team. Now, the interesting thing about a relay team is, of course, the first runner completes their run and hands on the baton. They've done. It's all over. They've finished. The second runner picks up the baton, and it's only the final runner that crosses the line. But the first runner is still going to say, well, hang on, I'm as responsible as the final guy for us winning this. So each of them has an individual end, let's say, to run as fast a time as they can for their leg of the race. But each of them equally has, as it were, the collective end that they collectively win the race. Okay, so that seems fine. Not necessarily a matter of moral responsibility, depending on how sort of committed a sports fan you are. Some people suggest perhaps. But at any rate, is that the model that we can utilise? Should we think of as what I'm calling the chain of moral responsibility? Does it just reduce? Is it just another case of collective responsibility in the relay, but now in the relay sense, where it's just the mere fact that you've completed your action temporally, but it's exactly the same end that you're aiming at. And therefore, if the individual actions and the collective end are morally significant, you can be held morally responsible. And so it's just to be understood in those terms. Well, I suggest that that's not the case, and that therefore the concept of the chain of moral responsibility is somewhat different from the ordinary notion of joint action and collective responsibility for a collective end aimed at, that the things are slightly different. But an alternative picture, you might say, well, in that case, there is no responsibility of the detectives for the final outcome. They just are to be held responsible at the point where they gathered the evidence and the brief and present. That's it, they're out of it. They're morally responsible for that, and they have no responsibility whatsoever for the fact that he was tried and convicted. So that might be an alternative picture. Now, I suggest that neither of those pictures is actually correct, and I want to suggest that the concept of the chain of moral responsibility can be helpful here and display a slightly more nuanced relationship between the team of detectives and the final outcome. So let's, again, bear with me on these assumptions, and people can dispute this, but I don't think it's going to make a lot of difference if we shift the assumptions around. But let's assume, the second last dot point there, that what the detectives are clearly responsible for is as it were, factual knowledge that as to the identity of the Ripper, that the Ripper is so let's grant us that that was their job, that's what they've done. End of story. And let's assume that what the jury does, just to simplify, let's talk about the jury, that the jury is responsible for arriving at the conclusion that the Ripper is in fact legally guilty, which is a somewhat different outcome. It's a somewhat different proposition from the one to merely have factual knowledge. So there's those two collective epistemic actions for which each party can be held morally responsible. So let's grant me that. Okay. So then the question is, given that I don't want to suggest that that's the end of the matter, I do want to suggest that there's some responsibility of the detectives for the final outcome. But at the same time, I don't want to argue that it's a simple case of relay collective responsibility. What do I think? Well, one way we might think of this is that just to get a better handle on this, is that of course the joint epistemic action of the jury is temporally later, but it presupposes and to some extent relies on the joint epistemic action of the detectives. I mean, the jury can't sit down and start making its adjudication unless the detectives have done what they've done. So it's not as if they're just two separate collective actions. So that second alternative I offered has not been correct. I don't think can be correct. There's some sort of relationship between these two joint actions, these two joint epistemic actions, because the second one presupposes the first, and in fact, to some extent, hopefully to some extent actually relies on it, since the evidence that's being used by the jury in their adjudication is evidence which is to a significant extent actually provided by the detectives in the first instance. So it looks as though it's a necessary condition for the jury, let's say, at least in the standard case, and I know there's questions of plea bargaining and blah, 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 but let's just say in the standard case that the work of the detectives, the successful, hopefully, collective epistemic action of the detectives is a necessary condition for the outcome that the jury arrives at. So in that sense, the detectives are implicated, if you like, in that final adjudication made by the jury. But also interestingly, the joint epistemic, let's come back to the detectives, the joint epistemic action of the detectives actually institutionally triggers the joint epistemic action of the jury via various mechanisms and so on and so forth. And so, in some sense or other, and I've got to be a bit careful here, the action of the jury is actually a necessary condition, at least potentially, for the action of the detectives. So there's a two-way relationship, I would suggest, between these joint epistemic actions. Now, of course, one thing I don't want to talk about is what actually happens, this being a normative kind of thing. So we need to kind of just remind ourselves that this has to be framed in terms of what ought to happen. Okay, so we're talking about essentially normative claims here. So let me see, finally put this, a couple of propositions to you, or one proposition actually. In light of what I've just said, and notwithstanding the fact that there are these, as it were, at one level of description, logically distinct joint epistemic actions, given the relationship of necessity that I've put on the table, cannot we not say that detectives and members of the jury ought to have as a collective epistemic end that justice will be done? Now that's a, they've both got that as a collective epistemic end. Even if the detectives do not have as a collective epistemic end that this person is factually guilty or not guilty, which is the jury's collective end, and even if the jury doesn't have that narrow collective end that the detectives have, perhaps they have in common this more general collective end, which might be rendered as follows: that the detectives and members of the jury ought to have as a collective end that the factually guilty will be found legally guilty and the factually innocent will be found legally innocent, and that's the common collective end that they have, even though they have their somewhat different specific collective ends which are constitutive of their specific joint epistemic actions. Thanks.
Willing to take a few questions for a few minutes?
Sure.
The thing that I couldn't move out of my mind in this presentation was the juries and detectives and prosecutors who have led to the conviction of innocent
Right.
individuals. And so I think that I wondered if you had explored any of the defense briefs that's trying to overcome those, whether there's any relevant discussion in the legal briefs of the people who made contentions about false convictions, particularly false convictions involving very serious charges. This would seem to give us a path to talk about some responsibility in those cases.
Right, yeah, so obviously, as I said, this is a kind of normative story, and unfortunately, when we look at the real world, it turns out that these aren't necessarily the aims of the individuals concerned, and certainly even when they are the aims of the individuals concerned, mistakes are made. Now, some of those mistakes, of course, are understandable. I mean, it's a figuring out what's actually going on is actually not necessarily that easy in a lot of instances, and so it's not as if every time someone makes a judgment or a group makes a collective judgment, it's not as if one could blame them even when they get it wrong, because on the balance of the evidence it looked, and so on and so forth. But I think it provides I hope it provides, as a normative framework, some kind of direction. So, I mean, let's take one kind of hotly disputed area, where it's claimed that, particularly in the context of an adversarial system and so on, the police, the detectives in particular, are just trying to nail this guy and get him tried and convicted, or for whatever the crime is, and that they don't take a sufficiently, as it were, impartial standpoint. So they're not really looking for ever exculpatory evidence. They're always looking for, that may be unfair, and that's an empirical question, and people such as the sociologist whose name now escapes me have claimed that that's actually empirically false. A lot of people have claimed that it's true and it's a function of the system and so on and so forth. But I mean, one of the questions then is that what people tend to then say is fall back on the view, well, and the detectives should have nothing to do with and shouldn't be at all concerned with, and it's not their business to worry about the ultimate outcome. And they've just got to worry about gathering the evidence and leave it at that. And what I'm suggesting is a sort of in a way, a mid path that says, well, yes and no. On the one hand, they have that, and I haven't precisely defined it, but they have that, as it were, intermediate and specific direct collective end, which is what they're, as it were, paid to do in the first instance. But on the other hand, it's important to see that they are part of a larger process, and therefore there is relationships between what they do and the final outcome, and to some extent they can be held responsible for that. But there are all sorts of then specific issues. If we render the thing in terms of epistemic action as opposed to behavioural action, I think one of the things that at least comes out of what I'm suggesting is that the idea that if you happen to have a belief, you come to have a belief, well, beliefs are just things you don't actually have control of in a lot of the philosophical literature. If it's the case that these are matters of judgment and therefore they're epistemic actions which you can get right or wrong, then I think that puts a lot more, in a sense, crystallises their responsibility in a way in which I would suggest the sort of other philosophical theories don't, because they kind of stop at, well, you can gather evidence and so on, you can be responsible for not gathering it, but as it were, at the level of the actual inference making and the judgment, that is at the level of the mental acts, you're kind of off the hook, because that somehow just, these beliefs get formed, and so I think that's quite important as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Normally it's the prosecutor who takes the...
Oh, right, and I've left, yeah.
Because of having made decisions that
right.
Go forward, but it also may be interesting to include the detective.
Right, and I've kind of grossly simplified, yeah. We got one guy at the...
Professor, thank you very much. As a former police manager, I was relieved that you've not had isolated police managers as morally responsible.
Well, I actually, they're another group I left out of the mix, but anyway.
You chose detectives, and,
yeah.
and as Malcolm Sparrow says, detectives operate in that gray area anyway.
Right.
But if you were to look at the collective responsibility of the police in general,
right.
which presupposes the myth that there is a criminal justice system,
right.
as your chain
right.
alleges, I would suggest that the only way that we could have true accountability in an example such as this is if that chain were actually connected at both ends, that it were a loop, and the jury's decision for a police manager would require, if they found the defendant not guilty, then that case should be reopened in order to determine who was factually responsible for those crimes. Because as a police manager, if you're lumping 13 cases or 20 cases, I don't know if Leeds and Bradford were jointly investigating this or if it was just Leeds. I don't know the system.
West Yorkshire Police, yeah.
But
yeah.
if you're looking at these cases collectively, then if one gets away, you should be held morally responsible to pursue that one case, to find out what happened.
Yeah, well, I guess the management thing is interesting. I mean, this raises. I mean, I've tried to I've kind of really simplified the notion of collective responsibility and just tried to have a sort of team and a jury, a nice, discrete little group of people that, you know, yeah. And of course that's somewhat idealisation, and in other places I've said, look, this is how you need to complicate the notion of moral responsibility, and you've got to talk about it in institutional context, and you have layered structures of, I mean, blah, 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 and indirect and marginal and diminished and so on and so forth. But obviously I mean, one of the issues you raise is, and particularly with respect to police management, I mean, they've got a certain number of resources, and so they're going to have to make decisions about, and similarly with caseloads and so on. I mean, the decisions need to be made about particular cases. Now, in a sort of ideal world, they would have all the facts at their disposal, and they would be able to sort of do a triage, and we're not going to look at this because this is less serious and so on. Now, if you look at some of those cases which involved Sutcliffe in minor matters that were actually on the books, and the failure to connect, you can perfectly well understand the individual police officer saying, well, this idiot's carrying this, but he's sort of annoyed, or he's been stalking this prostitute, but that doesn't seem to add up to much, and I think he's really just a guy that's out looking to do some theft or something, you know. I mean, because of course they're, you know, you've got Joe police officer kind of focused on this guy that they've just apprehended and they've interviewed and so on. I mean, of course, there's to some extent, presumably the job of the manager is to have the more of a bird's eye view. So you've got to some extent, I take it, hopefully a kind of reciprocal relationship between what the manager's trying to do with resources, with knowledge of what's happening where and what's more important, you know, whereas the individual, particularly perhaps not so much a senior detective, but perhaps a street cop, relatively, you know, a constable in our system, is got a kind of myopic view, and to some extent may not be particularly well positioned to make judgments. So, I mean, there's a lot of complexities here, and yeah, your question raises a whole raft of issues that hopefully I don't have thankfully I don't have time to answer. Sorry, John.
Yeah, a couple of times you mentioned that it's widely held that generally with regard to belief, there isn't much of a role for volition, and that is widely held. You know,
amongst philosophers, yeah.
Right, I mean, if the lights are on and I turn towards the wall, I'm going to see that there's a white wall.
Right.
But I want to try out a suggestion about that issue, and I just want to see what your response to this is. And the suggestion is that, in fact, there's actually a pretty significant role for volition with regard to belief in the following respects, that most of our beliefs are not irresistible in the way that one's irresistible.
Right.
Huge numbers of the beliefs that we accept on the basis of testimony.
Right.
Lots of other beliefs that we accept on the basis of inference, on the basis of judgments, and so forth. And so, even though it might be the rare occasion when there's a discrete sort of psychological episode of volition with regard to belief,
Right.
somebody might suggest there's actually an important, extensive role for volition in the respect that the things that we accept on the basis of various norms
Right.
and habits, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, in that sense, there's an important role for volition, though not as a sort of discrete psychological episode. Well, okay, what's the relevance of that to this? The relevance would be the question would be, in the context of criminal investigations and investigators, are there any distinctive sort of epistemic moral responsibilities other than the ordinary ones
Right.
Or is it just that in that context, the issues that we're dealing with are morally significant issues? But the suggestion about volition was, look, there's sort of epistemic responsibility all over the place
Right.
with regard to what we discussed.
Right. Okay, good. Yeah. Look, so well, first of all, I think we're on the same page that there are lots of beliefs that aren't volitional. I mean, aren't volitional. I'm not claiming. I mean, the light exam. I mean, we go wander around. Dropped a brick on my foot, I believe. So there are all manner and very large number of ongoing belief acquisitions, which volition is not particularly involved. So the question is whether or not there's some important ones that it is involved. Okay, and I've focused on these, as it were, cases where I'm making an explicit judgment on the basis of reasoning, and there's a matter at hand which is relatively difficult to figure out, and so on and so forth. But yeah, John rightly raises the case of, well, hang on, there's a whole lot of other belief acquisitions that we engage in, which are actually neither of those two categories. I think if I've got you right, because to some extent we acquire an enormous number of beliefs, as it were, on automatic. We could actually sit down and reflect on them in any particular case, but of course there are so many of them going on so many times that we have, as it were, automatic procedures that we don't actually investigate every time round. So these, of course, include our compliance with rules. They also include, sort of complicated reliance on systems. So, we whack in something into the system and it throws up an answer, and it's only from time to time that someone actually goes to the trouble of checking whether or not the system is working properly and whether or not whether we should be actually just automatically accepting that. So I think there are, as you say, such a large number of these, and of course what's critical is that we just don't have the time and intellectual resources to make all those judgments all the time. Hence we need to have all these things on automatic. But having said that, there is an issue about the extent to which we, as it were, ought to look at the issue of the equipment from time to time, or of the rules that we're just automatically following, to see whether or not actually they're as good as they should be and whether or not we ought to change them. And that may be a matter of judgment based on reasons and so on and so forth. But when it comes to certainly the conventions and rules, that needs to be a collective matter. So I think there are a lot of cases. The other kind of case, which is I've said a little bit about somewhere else, is when let's come back, the replacement, it wasn't actually it was partly the Yorkshire case, but there's another famous case, Seumas case in the UK, where they triggered the construction of a computerised system, the so-called home system. And what's interesting so that this allows all sorts of complex cross-referencing and throws up lines of inquiry and blah, 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 blah. Now, what's interesting about that from the perspective of the interest in collective and collective epistemic responsibility is the different players. And if you think about it, you've got the people who designed the system, such as it is, and they're actually looking at a newer system, and because they reckon they've identified various deficiencies. But the people who designed it, then there's the question of the people who decided to implement it, and whether or not, because it's expensive, and the managers come into the mix. And then, of course, there's the people who use it, and the people who use it are a number of different people. There's the people who are providing input into it, who are entering the data, and of course, notoriously, I hope I'm not stepping on toes here, but notoriously, and to some extent understandably, individual police officers don't like entering data, or don't like, they kind of, let's get on with it. Do I have to keep entering this all this data? And their managers are sort of leaning on them to, but so that's another point of responsibility. And then, of course, there's the utilisation of it. When people start, as it were, using it to interrogate the data and cross-reference and all this other stuff that they do. So you've now got a very complicated situation where a lot of the stuff is on automatic. You're just assuming that the data has been put in, and you may have to assume that it's correct. You're assuming that it's reasonably well designed. It's fit for purpose. You're assuming a whole bunch of different things, and it may be that you just hit a button and it pops up, Peter Sutcliffe, and Bob's your uncle. But is there any responsibility for that? Well, actually, yes. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
Just a quick follow-up on this. Actually, what I had in mind was, since most of our beliefs are accepted on the basis of testimony,
Right.
inference, judgment, or inference to the best explanation, there's actually a role for volition in all of those.
Right.
Sort of decision to accept.
Right.
And if there is volition in all of those contexts, is there something additional in the context of criminal investigation, or is the difference really just the moral significance of the issue?
I see. Yeah. Well, there's certainly the moral significance, which doesn't necessarily enter into other areas, or at least doesn't in such an acute form. And there may be, there's what happens in the criminal justice system, at least ideally, I guess, and inevitably to some extent, is that there's a kind of what I'd refer to as the institutionalization of some of those practices. So it's not just, there's a sort of rough and ready sense of testimony as I wander around the place. John tells me this is a very fine bottle of wine, and I go, oh, is that right? Sure, John. And or someone else tells me something else, and whereas in the institutional context, the test, it's been formalised. It doesn't count unless you've written it down and signed. So there's a certain institutionalisation, and then we have arguments about. Probably need to have more arguments, actually, as it turns out, about the different kinds of evidence and the weight that should be given them in this context. Say, oh, well, I think we found the fingerprints, and someone says, well, actually, fingerprints, it's not quite as you think. And so then you've got a problem because you've got various complex scientific issues, or DNA is another example, where we have to find some sort of institutional solution to how that's to be understood and what weight it should be given and so on, and it may be quite... So I think there's a kind of big institutionalisation process that goes on, which makes a difference in the criminal justice system, which might not in other contexts, or might do so differently. Yeah.
Time for one more question.
I'd like to know how you distinguish collective responsibility from individual responsibility.
Right.
Think back to your relay team.
Yep.
The person who runs the first section says, look, I'm as responsible as the last person who wrote the tape. That's fine. We are collectively responsible for winning the things, the chain there. What if the third runner drops the baton? That's not something to be sheeted home to the first runner who managed to pass it on adequately to the second and so on. The same kind of thing, operates in the policing case. If the police may do all of their work well, but the jury screws up for some reason. And so how do you distinguish what people should be held individually responsible for collectively responsible?
Right. Well,
it works much better when you've got a success story.
Right. Well, there can be collective failures and individual. The collective responsibility story that I'm offering you includes individual responsibility, because remember, each individual has their particular task, and they have a particular individual end that task realises. So, my particular task is to run this first 100 yards and to make sure I'm ahead of the other guys at the end of the 100 yards. And I can fail in respect of that individual action. Okay. Now, and of course then there's the success if we all whatever. Now there could be, it depends there's all sorts of different examples. In one kind of, there are lots of examples, for example, where I only make a causal contribution, a minor causal contribution, and we all make a minor causal contribution, and yet I'm still going to claim some responsibility for success, even though my contribution was was negated for some reason. But it partly depends, I think, on the different examples. I mean, here's another kind of example where it's a piece of wrongdoing. So you might say, let's assume that this is a sort of example I've used in a different context, but let's assume there's 10 of us and we attack you, not you obviously, John, but someone, with a view to killing them. And what we each do is we each stab the person. And as a consequence of being stabbed 10 times, the person dies. But it was only necessary to stab him 6 times. So no particular act of stabbing is necessary in the circumstances to realise the collective end. So my act of stabbing was not actually necessary and certainly not sufficient to kill the person. But nevertheless, I'm held we're collectively and I'm individually part of the responsibility. Why? Because I pursued an individual action which had an individual end to stab him. And secondly, I did so in the context of having the same end as everyone else, the collective end to achieve. Now, if it turns out that you've got cases where I fail in some reasonably strong sense and it's entirely my own individual action, albeit in the context of the collective end, then we can say that I'm responsible for failing to achieve, individually responsible for failing to achieve that purpose. But we also have to say in the relay example, given my action is necessary, we also have to say, well, and we collectively failed to achieve the collective end. We didn't achieve it, even though the responsibility for that failure, as it turns out, may be wholly my own. I mean, if everyone else did their bit, so I mean, to sort of in a nutshell, I want to have it both ways. I want to talk about, yeah, as you would probably have assumed. Okay, thank you. Thanks.